The news came quietly, not through a press release or a dramatic announcement, but through a phone call that left Betty Whittaker sitting at her kitchen table in stunned silence. Adult Protective Services had approved a visit, not a reunification, not a permanent return, just a visit, supervised, limited, carefully controlled. But for Betty, it felt like the first crack in a wall that had been standing between her and her family for far too long. She held the phone in both hands after the call ended, staring at the worn tabletop where her family had eaten countless meals together. Her lips trembled as she whispered the words out loud, almost to test if they were real. I get to see them. It wasn't joy that flooded her first. It was relief. Heavy, aching relief that made her chest tighten and her eyes burn. For weeks, Betty had lived in a state of waiting. Waiting for answers. Waiting for permission. Waiting for someone in authority to finally see her not as a case file, not as a problem to manage, but as a mother and sister whose life had been split apart. Now, with this one decision, everything shifted, not enough to heal the wound, but enough to remind her that the bond hadn't been erased. Brian was the first person she called. They said yes, she told him, her voice shaking. They said, I can see them. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Brian exhaled slowly, as if he'd been holding his breath for days. That's big, Betty. That's real big. I don't know how long, she said. They didn't say much, just that it'll be supervised, and I gotta follow every rule they give me. You'll do that, Brian said gently. You always do. When he arrived later that afternoon, Betty was already cleaning, even though the visit wouldn't happen for days. She wiped down counters that were already spotless, folded blankets that hadn't been touched, straightened photos on the wall. It wasn't about appearances. It was about control, about doing something, anything, in a situation where she'd had so little say. I don't want them thinking I ain't ready, she said, scrubbing at the same spot on the counter for the third time. Brian watched her quietly. He'd seen this before. The way hope didn't come softly for Betty. It came with fear attached. Fear that one wrong move, one misunderstood word, could take it all away again. They're coming here? He asked. She shook her head. No. They said it'll be at a different place. Neutral. Quiet. Her shoulders slumped slightly. I wish they could see home. I wish they could just sit right here like before. Brian nodded. I know. Word spread fast, as it always did. Within hours, online groups were buzzing. APS grants Betty a visit. First step toward reunification. Some celebrated. Some doubted. Some warned that a visit didn't mean anything long-term. But for the first time in a long while, the conversation wasn't only about loss. It was about possibility. That night, Betty barely slept. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying memories she hadn't let herself touch in months. Timmy's laugh, Ray's quiet presence, Lorraine's familiar routines. She wondered how they looked now, if they'd changed, if they were scared, if they were angry. What if they don't want to see me? She whispered into the dark. Morning came too quickly. She sat at the table with her coffee growing cold, lost in thought when Brian's phone buzzed. Eric had posted. After weeks of silence, after saying he was done, Eric Carroll released what he called his final message. Not a video, not a live stream, just words. Direct, unfiltered, final. Brian read it twice before speaking. It's heavy, he said carefully. You want me to read it to you? Betty hesitated. Go on. Eric's message didn't try to defend itself. It didn't attack anyone either. It spoke of exhaustion, of mistakes, of good intentions that spiraled into something he never anticipated. He wrote about the pressure, the accusations, the guilt that followed him even when he stepped away. And then he addressed Betty directly. I never wanted to hurt you. I believed I was helping. Maybe I was wrong. If I caused pain, I'm sorry. I'm stepping away so you can have peace. Betty closed her eyes as Brian finished reading. He didn't mean no harm, she said quietly. People do things thinking they right. Brian studied her. You don't sound angry. I ain't got room for anger, she replied. It just takes up space where love's supposed to be. Eric's message ignited a storm online. Some saw it as accountability. Others called it too little, too late. Arguments reignited about money, about motives, about who failed whom. But for Betty, the noise barely registered. Her focus had narrowed to one thing: the visit. Days passed in slow motion. APS sent instructions. What she could bring. What she couldn't say. How long the visit would last. Who would be present. The rules were strict, clinical, and painfully impersonal. But Betty followed every word as if it were sacred text. She laid out closed days in advance, changing her mind again and again. She practiced what she wanted to say, then decided she wouldn't plan at all. She didn't want the moment to feel rehearsed. I just want to hold their hands, she told Brian the night before, just to know they real. When the day came, the sky was gray and heavy, mirroring the knot in her stomach. Brian drove her, the radio off, the silence filled with unspoken prayers. Betty clutched her purse like a lifeline. As they pulled into the parking lot, her breath caught. They here? She asked. Brian looked ahead. Yeah, they're here. Betty's heart pounded so loud she thought everyone could hear it. Her legs felt weak as she stepped out of the car. An APS worker greeted her, calm and professional, explaining the rules one more time. Betty, the woman asked softly, are you ready? Betty nodded. I've been ready. The door opened. Time seemed to slow as she saw them. Timmy first, then Ray, then Lorraine. Older, thinner, different, but unmistakably hers. For a moment, no one moved. Then Timmy whispered, Betty. She broke. Tears streamed down her face as she stepped forward, careful, trembling. She reached out, unsure if she was allowed. The worker nodded. Betty wrapped her arms around him, then Ray, then Lorraine, holding them as if letting go might erase them again. I missed you, she sobbed. I missed you every day. The room filled with quiet tears, small smiles, shaky breaths. It wasn't enough time. It would never be enough time. But it was something, proof that separation hadn't broken what held them together. When it ended, too soon, Betty walked out holding herself upright, dignity stitched together by sheer will. She didn't collapse until she was back in the car. I saw them, she whispered. I really saw them. Brian reached over and squeezed her hand. That matters. That night, Betty sat alone in her kitchen, replaying every second. The way Timmy smiled, the way Ray looked at her, the way Lorraine held her hand just a little longer than allowed. APS had granted a visit. Eric had said his final words. The world kept arguing. But for Betty, something had shifted. Hope wasn't gone anymore. It was fragile, conditional, controlled by rules and timelines she didn't understand. But it was alive, and that changed everything. Tell me what you think about APS granting Betty this visit and Eric's final message. Share your thoughts in the comments. The days after the visit felt heavier than the weeks before it. Betty Whittaker woke each morning with the same memory pressing against her chest. The sound of Timmy saying her name, the warmth of Ray's hand in hers, the way Lorraine had leaned close as if afraid to let go. Seeing them again had given her life, but it had also reopened a wound she'd been forced to live with in silence. Now she knew exactly what she was missing. She kept replaying the visit in her mind, over and over, afraid that if she stopped thinking about it, it might fade. The way Timmy looked at her, searching her face like he was trying to make sure she was real. The way Ray had barely spoken but never once let go of her hand. The way Lorraine whispered, "You still my Betty," like it was a promise she needed to hear out loud. Betty sat at the kitchen table with her coffee growing cold, the house too quiet for her liking. She still cooked like they were all there. Still set extra plates, sometimes before catching herself, and putting them back in the cabinet. Old habits didn't disappear, just because the house had emptied. Brian stopped by later that afternoon. He didn't bring his camera. He hadn't much lately. The story had reached a point where filming felt intrusive, even to him. "You holding up?" he asked gently. Betty nodded, then shook her head. "I don't know. I'm happy I seen them. But now it feels worse." Brian sat across from her. "Worse how?" "Before, I was just waiting," she said. "Now I know what I'm waiting for." She folded her hands together, staring at her knuckles. "They different, Brian. They okay, I guess. But they ain't home. And I ain't with them. It don't feel right." Brian leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "APS said anything else yet?" She sighed. "They said the visit went well. That I did good. That they'll continue to assess." Same words every time. Assess. Review. Process. Betty had learned those words meant one thing. Time. Time she didn't feel she had anymore. That evening, Brian went live again. Not with breaking news. Not with accusations. Just an update. Betty got her visit, he told viewers. It was emotional. It was real. And it matters. But I want y'all to understand something. A visit don't mean reunification. Not yet. The system moves slow, and sometimes it moves without telling you why. The comments flooded in. Relief. Joy. Anger. Frustration. They need to bring them home now. This is cruel, dragging it out like this. At least you got to see them. That's something. Brian read through them quietly before speaking again. If you truly care about this family, keep them in your prayers and keep the noise respectful. Fighting online ain't helping Betty. Meanwhile, Eric's final message continued to ripple outward. Even though he hadn't said anything more, his words were being dissected, reposted, debated. Some people softened toward him. Others doubled down on their anger. The internet needed a villain or a hero, and Eric had been both, depending on who you asked. Brian mentioned it to Betty the next day. "People still talking about Eric," he said. "About his message." Betty waved it off. "Let them talk. I ain't mad at him." Brian raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" She nodded. "I ain't got hate for nobody. Hate don't bring my family home." That was the truth of Betty Whittaker. She didn't think in terms of sides or scandals. She thought in terms of people. And people, to her, were complicated but still worthy of grace. A few days later, APS called again. This time, they asked more questions. About routines. About medical needs. About how Betty planned to manage if her family returned. The questions felt endless, and some felt unfair. "They asked me how I'd make sure Timmy's safe," she told Brian later. "Like I ain't been doing that my whole life." Brian frowned. "What did you tell them?" "I told them the truth," she said. "That I always did my best. That I ain't perfect, but I love them. That nobody knows them like I do." APS didn't give her an answer. They rarely did. They just thanked her and said they'd be in touch. The waiting stretched on. Online, attention began to waver, as it always did. New stories surfaced. New dramas replaced old ones. The comment sections weren't as crowded anymore. But a core group stayed. They checked in. They asked about Betty. They prayed. One woman mailed Betty a handwritten letter. "I don't know you," it read, "but I think about you every day. I hope you know people care." Betty cried when she read it. Not because of sadness, but because someone had taken the time to write her name by hand. She taped the letter to the refrigerator. Another week passed before Brian got a call that made his stomach drop. "They're talking about long-term placement," he told Betty carefully. "Not saying it's final, just discussing it." Betty felt the air leave her lungs. "Long-term, it don't mean forever," Brian said quickly, "but it means they're considering options. Options that don't include me," she said flatly. Brian didn't argue. He couldn't. That night, Betty sat on the porch long after dark, wrapped in a thin sweater, staring at the hills. She talked out loud, like she always did when the house felt too empty. "I don't know what else to do," she whispered. "I done everything they asked. I'm still here. I'm still waiting. She thought about the visit again, about how Timmy had asked, "When can we come home?" and how she hadn't known what to say. "I'm working on it," she'd told him. But what did that even mean when the power to decide wasn't hers? Brian shared another update a few days later, his voice heavy. "I'm going to say something some folks won't like," he told his audience. "This story don't have a clean ending. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But Betty's still fighting. And as long as she's fighting, I'm not walking away." He paused, then added, "Eric, stepping away, don't erase what happened, good or bad. But right now, the focus needs to be on Betty and her family, not internet beef." The response was quieter than before, but more sincere. Less noise, more understanding. When APS finally called again, it wasn't with a decision. It was with another step. "They approved another visit," Betty said later, her voice cautious. "They said it means things are moving." "Are they?" Brian asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I'll take what I can get." She prepared again, cleaned again, prayed again. Hope, she was learning, wasn't loud. It didn't shout or celebrate too early. It whispered. It showed up quietly and asked you to hold on just a little longer. And Betty Whittaker had been holding on her whole life. Tell me what you think about Betty being granted another visit and the system continuing to delay a final decision. Do you believe APS is moving in the right direction or just prolonging the pain? Share your thoughts in the comments. The second visit came without celebration. There were no smiles when the call arrived, no relief, no sense of victory. Betty Whittaker listened quietly as the APS worker explained the date, the time, the rules. Supervised, limited, structured. Every word felt like a reminder that this wasn't her decision, and it wasn't her family anymore in the way it once had been. She thanked them politely and hung up the phone. Then she sat there for a long time, staring at the wall. Another visit meant another goodbye. That was the part no one talked about. The visits didn't heal the separation. They reopened it. Every embrace came with an expiration date. Every laugh ended with a countdown. Brian arrived the morning of the visit, not with a camera, but with quiet reassurance. He brought coffee, the good kind this time, and a bag of pastries he'd picked up from a gas station an hour away. "You don't got to be strong today," he said gently. "Just be you." Betty nodded. "That's all I know how to be." The drive to the facility felt longer than the miles on the road. Betty watched the trees pass by, each bend in the road reminding her how far away her family now lived, even though it wasn't really that far at all. Distance wasn't measured in miles anymore. It was measured in permission. When they arrived, the building looked clean, quiet, almost too calm. Nothing about it felt cruel on the surface, and that somehow made it worse. There was no obvious villain to point to, just rules, policies, smiling staff who spoke kindly and still controlled everything. Timmy saw her first. He froze for a second, like his brain needed time to catch up to his heart. Then he smiled, so wide it looked like it might break his face. "Betty," he said, his voice shaking. She didn't answer. She just opened her arms. Ray came next, slower, careful, but just as sure. Lorraine hovered for a moment before stepping forward, her eyes never leaving Betty's face. For a brief moment, the world made sense again. They sat together at a small table. Plastic chairs. A clock on the wall that Betty refused to look at. The staff member stayed nearby, but gave them space, pretending not to listen while hearing everything. "How you doing?" Betty asked softly. Timmy shrugged. "Okay, I guess. They got rules." Ray nodded. "Food's all right." Lorraine leaned close. "I don't like sleeping there," she whispered. Betty's heart cracked, but her face stayed steady. "I know, baby. I know." They talked about small things. The weather. What they'd eaten. A bird Timmy had seen outside his window. Betty told them about the garden she hadn't planted yet, about the radio still playing their favorite songs, about how she kept their rooms just like they left them. "You didn't throw our stuff away?" Timmy asked, panic flickering across his face. No, she said quickly. Nothing's gone. Everything's waiting. The word waiting hung between them. Ray squeezed her hand. You coming back? I'll always come back, she said. As long as they let me. That was the truth she hated saying out loud. When time was up, the staff member cleared her throat gently. The signal. The ending. Lorraine hugged her hard. Don't forget us. Betty pulled back just enough to look at her. Never, she said firmly. Not for 1 second. Timmy's voice broke. When we coming home? Betty swallowed. She had practiced answers for this moment. None of them felt honest enough. I'm working on it, she said again. Every day. The ride home was silent. Brian didn't turn on the radio. He didn't ask questions. He let the quiet sit where it belonged. When they reached the house, Betty didn't go inside right away. She stood on the porch, looking at the door like it might open on its own and everything would be normal again. They're changing, she said finally. Brian nodded. Yeah. I'm scared, she admitted. Not just that they won't come back. I'm scared that if they do, they won't know how to live here no more. Brian didn't rush to reassure her. That's a real fear, he said. The system changes people. That night, Brian posted a short update. No footage from the visit. No details that felt too personal. Betty had another visit, he wrote. It was emotional. It was hard. Please keep praying. The comments came, fewer than before, but still heartfelt. Some people expressed hope. Others anger. They're just dragging this out. They're breaking that family. At least she gets to see them. Betty didn't read the comments. She sat at her kitchen table writing letters instead. One for Timmy. One for Ray. One for Lorraine. She wrote about the house. About the hills. About how nothing had changed and everything had. She sealed each envelope carefully. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, conversations were happening that Betty wasn't part of. Meetings, evaluations, discussions about long-term stability and appropriate placement. Words that sounded reasonable in an office and devastating in a living room. Brian learned some of it through back channels. A caseworker he'd spoken to once before hinted that the agency was leaning toward permanent arrangements. They think it's safer, she'd said. Safer. Brian struggled with that word. Safer than what? Than family? Than love? He told Betty what he knew, gently, carefully. They're considering keeping them where they are, he said. Maybe allowing visits, but not reunification. Betty stared at him. So that's it? No, he said quickly. It ain't final. But it's on the table. She nodded slowly. They always had a table, she said. I just wasn't invited to sit at it. That night, Betty prayed harder than she had in years. Not for miracles. Not for justice. Just for understanding. For peace. For strength. Across the internet, Eric's absence became more noticeable. No posts. No clarifications. No defenses. His silence became its own statement, interpreted in 1,000 different ways. Some said he was relieved to be free. Others said he was hiding. A few said he was grieving in private. Betty didn't know any of that. She remembered him as the man with the camera who had once promised help. That was all. A few days later, she asked Brian a question that stopped him cold. If they don't come home, she said quietly, do you think they'll forget me? Brian shook his head immediately. No, never. She nodded, but her eyes stayed distant. I hope you're right. The third visit was scheduled tentatively, not confirmed. The language was careful. Conditional. Betty stopped counting days. It hurt too much. Instead, she focused on routines. Cleaning, cooking, sitting on the porch, waiting for the mail, waiting for the phone. Waiting had become her full-time job. Brian continued to update sparingly. He refused to speculate. He shut down arguments in his comment sections. He reminded people that this wasn't entertainment. These are real people, he said in one quiet live. And this ain't a game. The audience was smaller now, but those who remained were listening. One message stood out to Brian. A woman wrote, No matter what happens, thank you for not walking away. Brian read it twice. Betty received another letter from APS. This one asked her to attend a meeting. No promises, no outcomes, just a meeting. She folded the letter carefully and placed it next to the others. Guess we'll see, she said. Hope is still there. Thinner, quieter, but alive. And as long as Betty Whittaker was still hoping, the story wasn't finished. The meeting took place in a room that felt intentionally neutral. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, a table too wide for comfort. Betty Whittaker sat with her hands folded in her lap, her Bible resting beside her purse. Brian sat next to her, not as a representative, not as a creator, just as someone who refused to let her sit alone. Across the table were two APS officials and a case coordinator. Their expressions were calm, practiced, unreadable. They thanked Betty for coming. They acknowledged her cooperation. They told her she had done everything asked of her so far. Those words sounded like praise, but they carried no promise. Then the language shifted. They talked about long-term care plans, about stability, about consistency, about what they believed was in the best interest of Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy. Betty listened carefully, nodding when appropriate, but her hands tightened with every sentence. Finally, she spoke. So are you saying they ain't coming home? The room went quiet. One of the workers cleared her throat. We're saying that full reunification is unlikely at this time. Unlikely. Betty felt the word land in her chest like a stone. But I'm getting visits, she said. You see my house. You see me. You said it yourself. I done what you asked. Yes, the coordinator replied gently. And those visits can continue, possibly even increase. But bringing everyone back into the same household present concerns. Concerns about what? Betty asked. Her voice didn't shake. Not yet. Capacity, the woman said. Support. Sustainability. Betty leaned forward. I took care of them my whole life. And we recognize that, the worker said. But circumstances have changed. That was the sentence Betty would replay later. Circumstances have changed. As if love had an expiration date. As if history could be erased with paperwork. Brian watched Betty's face carefully. He saw the moment something shifted. Not anger. Not panic. Something quieter. Heavier. Acceptance brushing up against grief. So what happens now? Betty asked. The plan was laid out carefully. More evaluations. Continued placement. Scheduled visits. Possibly permanent arrangements with oversight. Betty nodded slowly. You gonna tell them? The workers exchanged a look. We can support you in that conversation. No, Betty said firmly. I'll tell them. The meeting ended without resolution, but with finality hanging in the air. In the parking lot, Betty sat in Brian's truck for several minutes before speaking. I thought if I did everything right, it'd be enough, she said softly. Brian didn't rush to fill the silence. You did do everything right. She shook her head. Then why does it still feel like I lost? That night, Betty called Timmy. She didn't sugarcoat it. She didn't lie. They don't think you coming home, she said gently. There was a long pause on the line. Oh, Timmy said. Just that. Ray reacted differently. He grew quiet, withdrawn, his words slower than usual. Lorraine cried. Not loud, just steady. Betty listened to all of it. She didn't try to fix their pain. She let exist. I ain't leaving you, she told them. I don't care what papers say. I'm still your family. We still yours? Lorraine asked. Always, Betty replied without hesitation. After the calls ended, Betty sat alone at her kitchen table until the sun came up. The next morning, Brian went live. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. I'm not going to dress this up, he said. APS is not planning full reunification at this time. Visits will continue, but the family may not live together again. The reaction was immediate. Anger, grief, accusations, arguments. Some blamed the state. Others blamed Eric. Others blamed Betty herself, cruelly and unfairly. Brian shut that down quickly. If you're here to point fingers, he said, you're missing the point. He shared Betty's words instead. She said she didn't lose her family. She said the system don't get to decide who she loves. That reframed everything. Eric's name surfaced again in the comments. People demanding statements, demanding accountability, demanding explanations. Then, unexpectedly, Eric sent one final message. Not public, not dramatic, just a short voice note to Brian. I didn't know how to fix it, Eric said. I thought helping meant changing everything. I see now that sometimes helping just means staying. I didn't do that. Brian asked Betty if she wanted to hear it. She did. She listened quietly, her face unreadable. When it ended, she nodded. Tell him I forgive him. Brian blinked. Just like that. I don't got the energy to hold on to bitterness, she said. It won't bring my family home. The weeks that followed were quieter. No big updates. No viral moments. Just visits. Betty traveled when she could.